and take notes, because at the end of this session, you will be quizzed. And now I want to, we got to take a quiz. I know what today is, but that doesn't mean that we slack off just because today is today. You're going to have some fun at the same time, so make sure you pay attention, okay? I'll be right back. Let me go get it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now today I want to briefly go over some very essential information concerning this topic at hand. And before I do so, I would like to state a few predominantly powerful and yet relevant quotes. And they are, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. James Baldwin. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture as like a tree without roots. Marcus Garvey. Now, a brief synopsis of these quotes entails that you and history are one and the same. History is written every time you're awakened without the convenience of utilitarian pens. And it also entails that cognizance of one's true genealogical background is the key to establishing benevolent growth as a nation of people overall. Now, with all of that being said, what made you believe that you came from Africa? Was it the statements from the white supremacists of the 60s, where they noted that if you don't like what's happening in America today, then go back to Africa? Or was it the establishment of the many activist groups of the 60s, where they marched in demand for equal rights, justice, and racial recognition inside of a capitalist society that was literally built solely on the grounds of inequality, racial discrimination, environmental and social injustice systematically? But the activists had their own individual propaganda? Or could it be the fact that nearly all of you were taught history during your industrialized public school days inside of a, quote, Sunday school classroom setting, where the teacher had been previously instructed to follow the manipulative orders of the public school board's curriculums of indoctrination? In my documentary called The Untold Truth about the duplicity of the public school system, I shared lots of historical accounts and unbiased information covering many details surrounding this entire ordeal. You were told that you came from Africa, but based on what evidence? See, now, the first thing that you learn in a, quote, Sunday school classroom setting is to stand in a straight line, quietly. That's merely a form of submission to authority in order to decimate literacy, a diabolical mind trick that governs you and misleads you directly into weakness. Why? Well, you were taught to listen and follow directions, and be sure to hold all questions until the end of the session. The teachers inform you to only ask the, quote, right questions, but what is considered to be the wrong questions? Well, the wrong questions would be you challenging the teacher with realistic questions that demands answers that will make logical sense. For example, who was the first to say that so-called African Americans came from Africa? Now, there is absolutely no records nor any documentations in Africa right now or even in the past that clearly states that all so-called African Americans immigrated from Africa. The only few that have said this to be true are some of the descendants of the European colonizationalists currently residing in the Americas. Along with the leaders of the Pan-African movement, leaders of the Hebrew Israelite movement, leaders of the Nation of Islam movement, leaders of the pro-black and woke movement, and leaders of the Moorish movement, in which all of these groups coincidentally derived during the early to mid 1900s, at a time when access to the World Wide Web didn't even exist. So Who actually manifested the proof to these self-proclaimed leaders that so-called African Americans came from Africa? Not only that, there are plenty of slave trade stories floating around North America with no actual publicly verifiable evidence nor official documentation of the sailboats, which are misclassified as slave ships by some people for some strange reason, that allegedly carried thousands of enslaved Africans from West Africa to North America between the 1600s and mid to late 1800s. Now, mind you, these alleged savage colonizers love to brag about their achievements before and after the slave trade era. So you mean to tell me that they can build Confederate statues and keep them up still to this day, create replicas of old war dugout buildings and battlegrounds, and even reenact famous wars, etc., but not one replica of these sailboats that allegedly carried thousands of enslaved Africans from West Africa to America was made? To elaborate on that note, mind you, if the colonizationalists carried over thousands of enslaved Africans on a sailboat, how did the captain and his crew survive? I mean, where was the room on these sailboats that they needed for their food supplies to last them all for months at a time while traveling back and forth across the Atlantic? Not only that, these sailboats at that time moved along according to the gust of the winds and the streams, or rather waves, of the oceans. So a sailboat captain and his 10 to 15 man crew, along with their limited amount of food supplies and other cargo like silver, gold, and whatever amount of enslaved Africans they captured from Africa, survived those blazing hot summers and those below freezing temperature winters without suffering from anything? Now, many of you would say that there is prehistoric evidence of so-called black people being in ancient Egypt due to a few foreign scientists that have dug up some of the graves there. And I agree with you, but that does not mean that African Americans came from Africa just because those foreign scientists dug up a few graves in Egypt. What is very important to note is that they chose Egypt as their place to dig and not anywhere in North America for some odd reason. Now, some of you may refer to DNA as evidence of so-called African Americans being from Africa, but yet there are two very important factual differences between a paternity DNA test and a genealogy DNA test. I have stated this before in my previous documentary called The Untold Truth about the DNA genealogy test and your results, that genealogy DNA testing is one big fraudulent guess. The top genealogy DNA scientists have admitted that their results amounts from genetic astrology after many lawsuits were filed against many popular genealogy DNA test companies. Those folks that have sued has won already, but it did, however, provoke the government to make it unlawful to sue those types of companies soon after multiple other lawsuits began to arise. This is the exact same way the government assisted the pharmaceutical companies. It is all just for profit and not for your best interest whatsoever. Now, really, I have nothing against Africa, nor Africans, but who's to say that they have nothing against us? See, now, there is a reason why Africans can immigrate to North America legally and immediately open up businesses with no problem. You'll see them owning businesses in so-called black communities right now, from Arab Africans to Ethiopian Africans, and the list goes on. And they are granted an entirely different line of credit from any so-called black person that resides in that same community. Watch my documentary called The Untold Truth about the history of credit and debit, and you'll get a better detailed understanding of what I'm about to state next. And that is, those Africans have a totally different classification of race according to the United States Census. And based on that classification of race and having been granted with dual citizenship, grants them specialized benefits and privileges by way of the federal government that African Americans will never see or benefit from, based solely on their misclassified identity and nationality. Now, according to records, the first enslaved Africans arrived in North America in the year of 1619, and slavery was abolished in North America in the year of 1863. So that gives us a total of 244 years where these European Americanized history books states that a grand total of 12.5 million enslaved Africans were imported from West Africa to North America. Now keep in mind that the U.S. population was not counted by the U.S. Census until the year of 1790, which is 171 years after 1619. So let's divide the total amount of years that it took them to import 12.5 million people. That number will be rounded to 51,230 people imported per year. Now, according to the 1790 census, which was the very first census in history, the U.S. population count was 3,929,214 people. Not everyone was accounted for due to the multiple documented indigenous Niji raids and rebellions that were occurring during this time period. But what is important to note here is that the 1790 census did not reflect a total amount of so-called slaves in America, which would have been a total of 8,760,330 imported Africans had we multiplied the years between 1619 and 1790, which is 171, with the total amount of enslaved Africans, which is roughly 51,230 each year. Now, I know what you're saying, but wait a minute, Dane, that wouldn't have made sense anyway. Why would they import more Africans than the total amount of themselves? But that's exactly my whole point. These numbers do not add up at all simply because the government has been lying to you. I mean, how can you literally make up an accurate number of imported Africans in 1790 when the actual records, in fact, does not exist? The U.S. Census has admitted that somehow the majority of their records of the 1790 census and up to the 1830 census were either lost or destroyed somehow. Mind you, that in between the years of 1790 and 1830, that all, quote, free people of color were stripped of their true identities and nationality to hide the truth, then purposely, forcefully reclassified as Negroes, coloreds, mulattoes, and blacks by the U.S. Census and the United States government. What is this truth, you ask? Well,
all glory go to the Creator. It's an honor to be here today. But I love the theme, America Healed. Well, first, let's think, where did America come from? America. It was just created to be America. Who are the real Americans? America keep changing and changing and changing. Let's go back in time when the American Indians looked like I look and roamed the southeast part of the United States freely. I love what the mayor said. We have to tell the truth. We cannot heal America until we fix the foundation. Can we start right there?
Okay, everyone. Now today I want to share some detailed paramount information concerning this topic at hand that many of you might not be aware of. But before I begin this segment, I would like to state a few indispensable quotes. And they are, a race of people is like an individual man until it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, expresses its own culture, affirms its own selfhood, it can never fulfill itself. Malcolm X. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Also, Malcolm X. A brief synopsis of these quotes entails that there is an uncommonly known factual description about racism. That alternative description would be best described as one's pride for one's own race. But that same pride is not limited to just love or respect for one's race, nor hate or discrimination when interacting with other races of people. It's deeper than that. See, when an individual's true heritage, identity, history, and culture is literally taken away from them during the times of forcefully establishing yet another race of people's uprising, that individual's race suffers tremendously from generations of historic and modified oppression, partisanship, and manipulation, systematically. Now, in today's society of America, the offsprings of the indigenous Nietzsche of Turtle Island are yet still undergoing the effects of these things that I just mentioned. When will this all stop, you ask? Well, once the indigenous Americans becomes cognizant of the differences between truths and facts, then, and only then, will the actual dialogue begin environmentally. See, for you as a person of color in America, there are two definitions of environmental racism. The not so verbally popular factor will be that racism is your environment. Racism is all around you. The other factor is a form of racial discrimination in the development and implementation of environmental policy, especially as manifested in the concentration of hazardous waste disposal sites in or near areas around facilities, which has to down and to drastically increase soon after I released this video. The NAACP has raised many concerns about this matter ever since the 1980s. Their most recent report entails that people of color are, quote, 75% more likely to live in so-called fence-line communities that are next to industrial facilities. The people of color who predominantly resides in these so-called fence-line communities are considered to be low-income residents, in which they are heavily targeted by environmental racism, with well over 1 million or so living just a half a mile from gas and oil facilities, leaving them facing some very serious health risks like cancer, asthma, and other respiratory diseases, just to name a few. Now, does the government have any idea that this is going on, with being one of the main causes of millions of people of color's deaths? Let's go some decades back in time to see where the real answer to this question resides. On September 27, 1962, author Rachel Louise Carson published a non-fictional environmental science book entitled Silent Spring that managed to immediately catch the attention of the entire nation due to what she detailed inside of the book. Carson's arresting book was carefully, well-researched, and unconventionally presented to the public. She mainly targeted the indiscriminate use of pesticides, which wound up causing an uproar and public debatable opinions. Carson's overall devotion derived from her fear that fewer species of birds will be singing each spring unless pesticide poisoning was retrenched. Readers of her book immediately caught the hidden message that Carson was blatantly exposing. Even though she was a bird lover, the book just wasn't only pertaining to birds being poisoned, but any number of humans dying from any number of hidden poisons lurking throughout the environment. Carson's research and other relatable works forced fears in and grieving anger from particular chemical companies and their affiliated organizations that campaigned to ban the release of her book, Silent Spring, nationwide. Many politicians were involved with quelling her speech and discrediting her character and research as she fought in the courts to get this information out. For example, the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Israel Taft Benson, wrote in a letter to the president at that time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, that because Carson was unmarried despite being physically attractive, she was, quote, probably a communist. Coincidentally, Carson mysteriously died just 2 years after her book was finally released. Now, she was previously battling breast cancer, but she died from complications of an undisclosed respiratory virus in 1964 at the age of just 56. Between the years of 1962 and 1970, millions of people drew their opinions and concerns about these ongoing chemical companies and their poisonous pollutants threatening humanity in North America. No real documented action was taken until the year of 1969, when then President Richard Nixon abided to eliminate the most threatening causes of death through water and airborne pollution. At a time when Nixon and his administration was preoccupied with the recession-ridden economy, along with the not-so-public-friendly war, Nixon established what was called a cabinet-level Environmental Quality Council, along with the Citizens Advisory Committee on Environmental Quality during the month of May in 1969. These councils or commissions that Nixon established did not sit well with millions of U.S. citizens, nor the national media for that matter. So Nixon moved on to position a consideration of a separate environmental federal agency in December of 1969. Very shortly after that, Congress sent Nixon a bill known as the NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. Listen closely. According to Congress, the NEPA of 1970 is said to be a U.S. environmental law that promotes the enhancement of the environment. The NEPA law states that its purposes is to, quote, declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment. 2, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere and stimulate the health and welfare of man. And 3, to enrich our understanding of ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation. But what is very important to note here, according to unclassified documents that I requested by way of the Freedom of Information Act, the NEPA of 1969 was created to, quote, ensure federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of their actions and decisions. One more time. The NEPA of 1969 was created to ensure federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of their actions and decisions. So you mean to tell me that not only does this NEPA Act blatantly exposes the fact that the U.S. federal government is responsible for poisoning our environment in America, but this NEPA Act is more like an open letter to ask for the mercy of these federal agencies to please consider their actions and decisions when they feel like impacting our environment? Also, keep in mind that this bill was signed and immediately passed into law on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1970, by President Richard Nixon. On January 22nd, 1970, Nixon gave his State of the Union address, speaking to both houses of Congress, stating that the, quote, 1970s, a historic period when, by a conscious choice, we transformed our land into what we wanted to become. Nixon continued this activist theme on February 10th, 1970, when he announced the 37 Environmental Action Program, listen to this, that gives special emphasis to strengthening these federalized programs when dealing with water and air pollution. 2 months after that, the celebration of Earth Day was born, April 22nd, 1970, when an estimated 20 million people showed up in support of this newly established environmental reform, allegedly. According to documented reports on this day, by way of the LOC, oil-coated ducks were dumped on the doorstep of the Department of the Interior. European American students disguised as the Grim Reaper stalked a General Electric Company stockholders meeting, while other European American protesters dragged a net filled with dead fish down Fifth Avenue and shouted to passerbys the phrase, "This could be you." So these reports proves that not everybody was in agreement with this environmental reform. The EPA, also known as the Environmental Protection Agency, was established on December 2nd, 1970 by then U.S. President Richard Nixon. Now, according to the United States government, the EPA is a federal agency of the United States federal government whose mission is to protect human and environmental health. So Nixon, along with his administration and other federal agencies, consolidated a variety of federal research, monitoring, standard setting, and enforcement activities into one federal agency in order to allegedly ensure environmental protection, or what the EPA is responsible for coining as environmental equity. But wait a minute. When you hear the word equity, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Money, value, rights, ownership. But we all know that equity can mean fairness as well, so let's see which definition they are using by the depictions of their direct actions. From the early 1970s to the mid-1990s, nearly all communities where people of color resided struggled with standing against the forced placement of toxic waste plants and other polluting facilities close to their neighborhoods. For example, in a 1982 Washington Post article, the term environmental racism was used when so-called African American protesters captured the national media attention by launching mass demonstrations against the proposed construction of a landfill for highly toxic chemicals known as PCBs in Warren County, North Carolina. Walter Fauntroy, who was the District of Columbia delegate to Congress in 1982, commissioned a U.S. General Accounting Office study which revealed that 3 of the 4 commercial hazardous waste facilities in EPA Region 4, which includes North Carolina, were all in areas that are occupied by people of color, while the 4th was in a low-income area that was predominantly occupied by people of color as well. Did the EPA do anything about this after it was brought to their attention nationally? No. So in 1983, Robert Bullard, a researcher and a pioneer in the environmental justice movement, concluded that he found in his research hard evidence that 21 of Houston, Texas' 25 solid waste facilities were located in neighborhoods where only people of color resided. So, did the EPA or the government do anything this time around? Not one bit. Thousands of similar reports were manifesting through the 1980s and 1990s from South Carolina, Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, California, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and the list goes on and on and on. During the early part of the year of 1994, many indigenous community leaders pressured then President Bill Clinton to sign an executive order on the term environmental injustice, which required all federal agencies to, quote, make achieving environmental justice part of its mission by addressing, as appropriate, disproportionately high adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations. Now, even though this 1984 executive order was federally mandated, few individual states promised to correct these life-threatening issues. The U.S. government, state governments, and the U.S. federal government all failed to perform their duties as delegated within this legislative motion. In fact, excluding the areas where European Americans resided that allowed for chemical facilities demolishment and rehabilitation and reconstruction of their communities as safe zones, the majority of the areas that were affected by this environmental racism are in fact still in that very same position today. This all goes back to what I stated earlier. For the people of color in America, racism is your environment because it is literally all around you. And since this form of discrimination works only against one race of people in this sense, and with both governments in full control of this entire poisonous operation, environmental racism is merely just a modified version of Jim Crow. Okay, everyone. Now allow me to open this video with acknowledging those of you who may have just recently discovered my channel for the very first time, and encourage all of you to go back and watch my previous documentaries, as they will in fact answer the majority of the same questions that I have received from you all, and even my most common viewers during the most earliest days of my channel's existence back in May 2016. Now, of course, I'm about to share some very distinctively detailed information with you concerning this particular topic at hand, because just like all of my other documentaries, this information is very critical when it comes to all Americans, and especially to those who are the direct descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of this land, now called North America. To uncover the truth about this topic, let's go back in time a little to where the Congress of the Confederation of the American Union authorized the design and implementation of the first official copper coin on April 21st, 1787. This copper coin was allegedly designed by Benjamin Franklin, meaning that there is no record of this, just the story, where this coin was later dubbed as the Fugio cent. This Fugio cent has a very uniquely interesting history about itself. For example, while being worth 1/3 of a dollar at that time, it borrowed its near entire design, yet from another coin that was worth an entire dollar at that time, but it never circulated, called the Continental Dollar of 1776. What is very important to note here is what's displayed on the Fugio cent. Located on the front side of the coin is a sun and a sundial, in which it is just above the phrase, "Mind your business." History says that the meaning of the phrase mind your business is to, quote, do your work, time flies. Keep that in mind. Now, on the other side of this coin are 13 rings, which are chain linked perfectly together to represent the 13 states, with the phrase, we are one, displayed directly in the middle. Now, from a quick glance, this may seem like your average coin, which happens to provide a few words of motivation. However, the engraved images and phrases found on this coin all have a double meaning. What I mean by that is, it initially served as a hidden form of communication that only a small group of elites were cognizant of its actual meaning at that time, in which it depicted a start of a particular prominent timeline, while also carrying along a much darker hidden agenda that details more untold historic information concerning the so-called copper-colored people in America. For example, the word Fujio is a Latin word that means I fly or flee, but with more distinctive researching, you'll soon discover that the word Fugio derived from yet another Latin word called fugere, which means to drive away or to make flee. In other words, the word Fugio literally means to make something disappear. Now, as we go further along throughout this timeline, you'll see exactly how this deceitful hidden agenda was carried out. In the year of 1855, a descendant of second-generation South African immigrant parents who migrated from Africa to New London, Connecticut in the late 1780s, Galusha Aaron Grow, a member of the Democratic Party, House of Representatives, and Speaker of the House, all from 1851 to 1863, had a change of heart and switched to the Republican Party, allegedly due to the signing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. But what's very odd about that is that Grow was the sole author and creator of the Homestead Act of 1862, in which the Kansas-Nebraska Act served as its precursor, with multiple southeastern copper-colored indigenous nations being removed from the lands of Kansas and Nebraska, along with other lands of the West. Now, keep in mind that these exact same native tribes or nations were forcefully immigrated with an E to lands west of the Mississippi River and into Kansas and Nebraska, for example, due to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Side note, the story surrounding this removal is also known as the Trail of Tears. Now, with this Kansas-Nebraska law in effect, this propelled the government to remove these Indians yet again. Some were placed in so-called reservations, while the majority of others were placed in areas that they called plantations. On the other hand, white settlers who were still immigrating to North America were treated benevolently and given these lands and farms that were literally stolen from our indigenous ancestors. This was also clearly mentioned by Martin Luther King just a few days prior to his assassination. You may watch more about that in my documentary called What Martin Luther King Was Trying to Tell You, But You Didn't Listen. Now, with all of that being said, this now brings us to the second 1-cent coin of this timeline. It is called the Flying Eagle cent, which depicts the removal of the copper-colored indigenous Niji, with an engraved image of an indigenous eagle facing, or rather flying, towards the left, indicating which navigational direction they were forced to walk. This coin was minted in the year of 1856, during the same time that Galusha Grow had his change of heart that I mentioned earlier, and also during the same time that he began formulating the Homestead legislation, which was essentially passed and signed into law by then President Abraham Lincoln in 1862. Now, the very next copper coin that was minted just 2 years later was the Indian head cent in 1858. The Indian head cent became immensely popular during this time period amongst the white immigrants for a very particular reason. And what is this reason, you ask? Well, again, it is more so pertaining to what this copper coin depicts. See, the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia's chief engraver, by the name of James Barton Longacre, enrolled and participated in a competition for the design of the next planned copper cent before becoming the chief engraver during the year of 1835. All participants of this contest were made aware that a dozen Indian chiefs will soon be visiting the President of the Union, or rather the United States, in hopes to make peace and come to the agreement of sharing their Indian territories with the already unwelcomed incoming white colonizationalists, and that the winner of this contest will have their design of the next mint shown to the president personally, soon after the, quote, meeting with the great white chief of the white people adjourned for final approval. What is very important to note here is that those particular Indian chiefs that I just mentioned did in fact go to meet with the president. However, this meeting, dubbed as the quote, meeting with the great white chief of the white people by Congress happened exactly 28 years after 1835, well beyond the completion of this contest. The Indian chiefs were invited by then President Abraham Lincoln to Washington, D.C. in March of 1863. And in this meeting, it was said that much talk of peace allegedly arose between Lincoln and the Indian chief's interpreter, in which several treaties were created and agreed upon by both parties in order to quell the Indians from raiding and rebelling against the still newly incoming white colonizationalists and their families, who immigrated from many parts of Europe and Africa to North America, even throughout this particular time period. These newly established treaties also made it clear that the Indians would be left alone to live their lives peacefully on their own lands. But these very same treaties were immediately broken, as well as the promise to honor the indigenous aboriginals with their image as the design to this particular coin. Now, let's jump back a bit here, because in the year of 1835, James Longacre and all other contestants were specifically ordered to create their designs of images of Indians on the front. But instead, James sketched an image of his flaming red-haired 12-year-old Dutch daughter named Sarah wearing an Indian headdress. With the approval of his wife, James's sketch became his contest entry. And when asked by political figures in charge of this contest, which Indian chief is your sketch depicting, James replied and revealed that the image is not of an indigenous person to America, but of his young Dutch daughter. So the Indian head cent is not of an image of Miss Liberty, as some authors of history loves to claim. No, because the truth is that James's sketch became the official image of the initial Indian head cent exactly 24 years later, during the year of 1859. So in other words, instead of placing an image of an indigenous person as promised during the meeting in Washington, they purposely utilized an image of a pale-faced immigrant in place of it, depicting exactly what their real agenda truly was. Side note, there is a big reason why they so desperately want to change the Washington Redskin name and logo. And no, it is not because it's some racial slur neither, which brings me to my very next point. The last 1-cent coin within this timeline is formerly known as the Lincoln cent coin, but nowadays most commonly known as the penny. On the front side of this coin, there is an engraved alleged image of Abraham Lincoln facing towards the right direction, and the backside has an engraved phrase, e pluribus unum, which translates from Latin to English as out of many, now one. Also, keep that in mind. This Lincoln cent coin, which is worth exactly 1/100th of a dollar, has been minted since the year of 1909 and beyond. It was said that this penny is to commemorate Abraham Lincoln's 100th birthday. But of course, this story was created just to cover up its actual hidden message that is being blatantly displayed throughout the creation of this coin. Literally, the Lincoln cent penny is used not just to commemorate the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln, but it also commemorates the signing of the Homestead Act of 1862, due to Lincoln being the president that actually signed this particular act into law. And in the year of 1909, when this coin was minted, this Homestead Act was being amended to further allow white European and white African immigrants to populate these lands by law. On March 3rd, 1909, which was the very last day of his second presidential term, Theodore Roosevelt signed what Congress calls the Act of 1909. But the hidden truth is that this law is the enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, a brand new amendment very similar to its 1862's predecessor. This new Homestead law perfected the purchasing of Indian lands, removed the restrictions on these lands, authorized the sale of these lands, referring to them as very important to note here is that there is a clause at the end of this amendment that states, quote, nothing shall affect the rights of the entrymen, in which these entrymen are the people migrating to these lands under this Homestead Act, making the lands of America their new homestead, which in turn makes them lawfully native to America. And quote, under the provisions of this law, nothing can be changed, in which this law single-handedly negates each and every treaty that was signed with our ancestors. See, that is the exact reason why these coins were created in the first place, because upon their circulations, it sends the encrypted message to the elite that their plans are being carried out successfully. So now you know that it is not a coincidence that Abraham Lincoln carried out the final part to this hidden agenda, which allowed for these lands to be stolen freely by a one-sided law system, which is why his alleged image is purposely engraved on the penny, being held as the lowest denomination of value ever within our economic currency. And now you are also aware that it is not ironic that Benjamin Franklin was appointed to initially create this plan, and also ordered to remind the other white colonizationalists in 1787 with that encrypted message stating to, quote, mind your business, or in other words, don't forget what you are here for, in which Franklin's image is purposely printed on the $100 bill, being held as the highest denomination of value ever in our economic currency for that exact reason.